talk about ethics for a minute. You'll like this one. You have a professor at school, in your high school and your college, who tells you everything is relative. No one has the right to impose their point of view on anybody. There isn't any absolute right and wrong. You've known some people like this, haven't you? Yeah. And then you get around to taking the final exam, and what you should do is cheat to your heart's content. Oh, absolutely. Let him live up to the consequences of his worldview. And then, and in fact, not only should you cheat, but I think you should blatantly cheat. I think you should make it obvious. I mean, look over on the other paper. Hannah, hello, professor, watch this. You know, the guy's going to come marching back there, grab your paper and say, you fail. Say, oh, no, you can't do that. This is where you broke one of the rules of the class. You cheated. And what are you going to tell to this professor who taught you there is no absolute right and wrong? You're going to say, hey, you told me there's no absolute right and wrong. Stop acting like there is now. Live up to your worldview. If everything's relative, so should my procedure in class. Some days I do my own work. Some day I do her work. And you can't say that that's wrong. You can just say that's not your preference, you know? Or imagine what the professor who teaches the relativity of everything would do when he goes outside and finds that his car has been stolen. You know, I'm waiting for the day. I don't think we'll ever see it, but I'm just waiting for the day that some unbeliever who teaches there isn't any absolute right and wrong doesn't call the police when his car is stolen. And he says, well, somebody took my car. I hope they enjoy it, and walks home. Yeah. I'm waiting for the day that an unbeliever has his or her best friend die and they do not weep at their funeral. I mean, after all, given unbelieving principles, we're just slime that's evolved out of the slime, aren't we? We're just at the front of the evolutionary arrow. And so when your dog dies or your horse dies or your pig dies or your best friend dies, it's all the same. Profess the principles of unbelief, and it's another thing to live with them. You cannot do science, you cannot do logic, you cannot do ethics, nor can you talk about the dignity of man and be an unbeliever. Science requires predictability, which requires that we don't live in a random universe. Logic requires universality, which requires that we don't live in a random universe. Morality requires absolutes, which requires that we don't live in a random universe. And so why do we let those who teach that this is a random universe turn around and utilize science or logic or ethics or morality to try to undermine Christianity, which is the only worldview, the only outlook that can account for those things and avoid the randomness of the universe? Where is the wise? Where's the disputer of this age? Hasn't God made foolish the wisdom of this world? For the world does not want to bow to the cross of Christ and to the teaching of the gospel, does not want to assume that the Bible has anything to teach us about reality, knowledge, and behavior. And yet these very same people have no basis to know anything whatsoever. If they were epistemologically self-conscious, if they were to live up to their worldview, they'd have to not only throw out Christianity, they'd have to throw out rationality. They'd have to throw out not only Christianity, but all ethical absolutes. They'd have to throw out not only Christianity, but the dignity of man. And yet they're not willing to go all the way. What they want is to sit on the Father's lap and slap his face and not be dropped. But the only way in which unbelievers are able to attack the faith is by first assuming that it's true. You say, boy, that's kind of weird. They actually assume what they are arguing against? Yeah, that's the very perversity of unbelief, according to the Bible. In your Bibles, turn to Romans, the 1st chapter. I'll bet you've read this before. Hopefully it comes alive for you here, because Paul says that's exactly what unbelievers do. They know God even while they are opposing God. Look at verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because that which is known of God is manifest in them, for God manifested it unto them. For the invisible things of him, since the creation of the world, are clearly seen, being perceived through the things that are made, even his everlasting power and divinity, so that they may be without excuse. Because knowing God, they glorified him not as God, neither gave thanks, but became vain, futile in their reasonings, and their senseless heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, well, you already know, don't you? Because Proverbs and 1 Corinthians already told you, they became fools. And the way in which they became fools is because they knew God in their heart of hearts, but they suppressed the truth in unrighteousness. And even though God made it very clear to them who he is and his existence and what he requires of them, they would not give thanks. They would not live up to that revelation. And suppressing the truth in unrighteousness, they became foolish in their reasoning, and their hearts were darkened. And the Bible says they are left without excuse. And the unbeliever gives the idea that, well, I just need some evidence. I'm just without a good reason to believe. Then you need to be aware of the intellectual and the spiritual game that is being played here. The Bible says they are without excuse. They have very clear evidence. And what they do is they mishandle it. They play around with it. They suppress it. Here in Texarkana, does it ever get warm enough to go in a swimming pool? I mean, I wouldn't know from what I've seen today, but all right. You've probably been to parties where you're in a swimming pool and you've got a volleyball or something, and somebody has always got to be the smart aleck who pretends, where's the volleyball, right? They push the ball under the water and hold it down and then say, who's got the ball? Who's got the ball? Why can't they see the volleyball? Because they're suppressing it. They're pushing it under. They're not wanting to have to see it, to experience it, and let others know about it. And so the unbeliever has got all sorts of evidence for God's existence. In fact, the evidence is so overwhelming that the Bible says the unbeliever is without excuse. You have no reason not to believe. God has made it abundantly clear that he exists and what he is like and what he wants from you. But you're playing this game. Gee, does anyone really know for sure? I want you to remember about the person doing that facetiously, pushing the volleyball under the water. Every time you have an unbeliever who says, well, if I just had some reason to believe, you need to know about this person that he or she is suppressing the truth. And by the way, when you suppress the truth, that means you have to be in contact with it, don't you? When you're pushing the volleyball under the water, you may not see it and no one else may see it, but it's in touch with you somewhere. And so it is, the truth of God is always in touch with the unbeliever. And then he fiddles with it, and he plays around with it, and he abuses it, and he rationalizes it, and he tries to pretend that no one can see it or that he hasn't seen it, when in fact he has.
This recording has been released into the public domain by the Bonson Institute, where we aim to bring into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ.
This portion of our seminar I'm going to call Kant in Context. And essentially, I just want to give you some history so you might appreciate what transcendental argumentation is all about and what Van Til is hooking into. Clearly, Van Til was not a Kantian. In fact, he, in a sense, spent his scholarly career refuting Kant and post-Kantian ways of thinking, especially as they came to expression in neo-orthodoxy and other theological aberrations. Nevertheless, Kant's project, the kind of thing Kant was doing, becomes the heart of Van Til's way of defending the faith. So I think it would be valuable for us to have an appreciation for the historical setting and what Kant himself said. Also give us some background for what Mike Butler is going to be doing with us tomorrow morning when we begin looking at contemporary transcendental argumentation and what the situation there is. So to put Kant in context, we're going to talk about his precursors, continental rationalism, as that was seen in the philosophies of Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz. This school of thought is called continental because these three men were on the continent of Europe. Makes sense. And they were all rationalists because they agreed on some things that I'll give you in a minute that define the rationalist approach. But it isn't as though they had the Continental Rationalist Club and this association got together every once in a while and issued their journal or what have you, but they're all, in retrospect, lumped together. And then British empiricism. What makes this nice is we not only have a difference in point of view, but we also have a difference in geography, so we can remember it. And three philosophers here, Locke, Berkeley, and Hume. Locke being English, Berkeley Irish, and Hume Scottish. I think they must have gotten together and divided that up and said, okay, now in England we're going to have this point of view, in Ireland. No, this is again retrospective, but it is very convenient so we can remember these. You have the rationalist approach, the empiricist approach, and then Kant comes along and offers us the transcendental approach or critical philosophy. And it's critical because he looks for the foundations of both rationalism and empiricism. He looks for the transcendentals that make it possible for us to reason both logically and empirically. Both rationalism and empiricism accepted the autonomous point of reference that is found in René Descartes' intellectual method. Descartes said, now what if I try to doubt everything that I can? Is there any way that I can come up with something that is beyond doubt? Can I answer the radical skeptic with any kind of indubitable? Is there anything that's beyond doubt? And he said, well, my existence is beyond doubt. Such a humble guy, this René Descartes, eh? Here's the one thing in the universe I'll tell you for sure, me. I think, therefore I am. Which, as some critics later said, he could as well have said, I stink, therefore I am. Because, after all, he has the I in the premise, and that's what he's trying to conclude. So, not much of an argument here. He was taking for granted his own existence when he argued for it. The point is that Descartes assumed man's intellectual self-sufficiency. Man can be his own starting point. There are a lot of things that are questionable about life, about things outside my mind, about the world. The one thing that's not questionable is me. I exist. I'm the point of reference. Everything finally is going to have to pass that standard. It's going to have to conform to what I know about me. Okay, so what I'm saying now is that the empiricist and the rationalist, and for that matter Kant too, they all assume the centrality of man. Now earlier when we did our light once over on different kinds of proofs, what did we say happens to them all? They reduce to what? Subjectivism and skepticism. Now why do you think that is? because man is put at the center. Since everything pivots around man, his thinking, his authority, since he's the point of reference, it shouldn't surprise us that when you start criticizing, it reduces down to man himself, his point of view. And since that isn't absolute and beyond doubt, it reduces to skepticism. All right, so these are autonomous schools of thought. First of all, continental rationalism. The rationalists all agreed on two things. First, there are self-evident truths from which we can deduce substantial conclusions about reality. There are some truths that are so self-evident that from them we can deduce the nature of reality. And secondly, that we should search for certainty in our knowledge where mathematics is the ideal of knowledge. The rationalist wanted certainty, and it had to be certainty along the model of geometry or math. Well, we've already criticized, I'm going to say more about them, but we've already criticized this, haven't we? If these are self-evident truths, why did Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz arrive at radically different conclusions about reality? One was a dualist, one was a monist, one was an atomist or a pluralist. Kind of strange if these are self-evident truths, isn't it? The rationalist had a supreme confidence in the intellect's ability to solve all human problems and to know reality understood as something fundamentally rational. Now, because reality is rational, you can understand that education for them became the key to enlightenment. If you want to solve man's problems, men need to be educated. Now, we may not be continental rationalists in our culture today, but are we rationalists in that sense? Do we still naively think that education will solve man's problems? Yeah. And why not? If reality is fundamentally rational, and man's mind can be counted on with clear and distinct ideas to deduce the nature of reality, sure. Supreme confidence in the intellect's ability. A reliable method of reasoning begins, as I've already said many times, with clear and distinct ideas. Well, if the indubitability of these ideas is their clearness and distinctness to me, notice that indubitability is tied to an internal and subjectivistic reference point. It's something in me, not outside of me, and it's something subjective. For Descartes, whenever we encounter a property, so I'm looking at an apple and I encounter its redness. Whenever we encounter a property, there's an unperceived substance present. If any object of thought is multi-propertied, it has many properties, then there must be a substance that, quote-unquote, holds the properties together. Yes? Apples just aren't red, are they? They wouldn't be very satisfying if they were just red. They're also spherical. Well, roughly spherical. They're also what? Crisp, sweet, tart, whatever. Well, why aren't all these things just loose and disjointed? Well, because the apple is a substance that has the properties red, sphericality, crispness, sweetness, what have you. So for Descartes, whenever we encounter a property, there must be an unperceived substance present. The key here is that the substance is unperceived. Has anybody ever seen the substantiality of an apple? Have you ever seen what binds the redness, crispness, sphericality? No, of course not. So in order to think clearly, I must assume that there's a substance. But I don't see a substance. I only see the properties of the alleged substance. According to Descartes, there are two different kinds of substance, mind and body substance. Some substances are not extended in space, like souls or minds. Others, like apples and giraffes, are extended in space. Now, Spinoza also wants to deduce the nature of reality from clear and distinct ideas. By definition, Spinoza says, a substance which must be independent of other things. You know why it's independent? Is because the substance is what unites the properties. makes one apple different from another apple, right? You don't just have redness diffused through the world, sphericality diffused through the world. You have sphere, red, crisp, so forth, all together in this one independent substance. But Spinoza says if by definition a substance is independent, then there can only be one substance. There can only be one independent thing. If there are two things, then they're conditioned by each other. The rationalists don't get a lot of good press in America. But when you think about it, that's a pretty brilliant argument. I mean, he says, look, conceptually, you're committed to be, if independence is a mark of substance, then there can only be one. Ultimately, there's only one substance. And therefore, all is one. And what we call everything, the substance of reality, is nature. He says, or if you have a religious bent, you can call it God. That's just kind of different vocabulary for the same thing. And therefore, for him, physics and psychology are deductive sciences. They are not sciences where you go out and observe empirically and learn about the world, but you can deduce the nature of the world, knowing that it's one substance and that you have clear and distinct ideas about your experience. Leibniz uses Spinoza's starting point that a substance is independent, and he draws the opposite conclusion. Since substance is independent, then there must be a plurality of independent things that don't have any relationship to one another. That's what makes them independent. Let me put it to you this way. For Spinoza, the independence of substance is gained by everything depending on it. For Leibniz, the independence of substance is gained by nothing interacting with anything. And so he said reality is made up of a number of, quote, windowless monads. They're windowless because you can't see and have any interaction with anything else. It's a monad.
So, to make sure, would you say then that they, Spinoza was focusing in on the one, Leibniz was focusing in on the many?
Yes, I would. Yeah, that's exactly right. But they begin with common premises and they end up with radically different conclusions about reality. Now, you will appreciate this, even if you don't like these guys so far and they confuse you. Both of them were eventually dismissed as dream philosophers who had gained coherence and experience in an artificial way. By their artificial conceptions of unity or independent pluralities, they had coherence, but it was all a dream a dream philosophy sort of thing. You could easily understand then why the British empiricists wanted to get away from all the abstruse speculations of the continental philosophers.
Yeah, in another sense, though, they both are also emphasizing the one and many, in the sense they both have a rational scheme. And yet you press on as it becomes irrational. Right?
Yes.
In one sense, you can say the one with atomistic is emphasizing the many flavors. The other sense, Spinoza is emphasizing the one split component. In the other sense, they both have a one and many aspect.
Mm-hmm. All philosophies do. Right.
What was their answer for bringing this together then?
Well, in the case of Spinoza, there's nothing to bring together. It's all the same thing. How do you...
You want me to understand that, don't you?
Well, not a lot. I mean, if you do, that would be better, but I don't have a real thirst to make people understand Spinoza because I'm not sure I altogether understand him. But what he would tell you is you don't have to worry about uniting mind and body, concept and percept, because they're just different ways of talking about the same thing. For him, the discussion of psychology, the discussion of physics are just like English and German, talking about the same thing. You talk in different language, but you're talking about the same thing because all is one. There's one basic substance. For Leibniz, he gets unity among all of his windowless monads by having a grand monad. True. That's what he calls God. The big monad. The grand monad. And God organizes all the monads so they don't run into each other, you know. They work together. You think I'm kidding you. You think I'm making this up. It's called the doctrine of pre-established harmony. The grand monad has pre-established the harmony of all monads. Mike, am I lying about this? I'm telling you, I wouldn't do that for you. This was what Leibniz said. Well, what's that? Yeah, that's right. That's why people dismiss this as a dream philosophy. It's just silliness. You know what? I'm very sympathetic, not to the overgeneral way he did this, but given what he had read, you can understand why David Hume said, gather all the books on metaphysics and consign them to the flames. He did. He was a librarian, by the way. Hume said, get all those books written by those nuts over there in Europe and burn them, because it's ridiculous. Okay. Now, we all, you know why we laugh at that, by the way? We all have a certain conception of what it is to think correctly, and we find this silly. The European mindset at that time was really, they thought that was very respectable stuff. But the British and then eventually the American tradition doesn't warm up to that kind of speculation. I'm sure that I've used this example with people before that are here, but it always gets the point across, and so I'm going to repeat it. If you want to understand the difference between European philosophy, British philosophy, and then American philosophy, imagine that you have an elephant on a barge just a little bit offshore, and the question is, how do you get the elephant to shore? 3 different approaches. The European philosopher will say, well, is the elephant real? The British philosopher will say, how much does the elephant weigh? And the American philosopher will say, how much will you pay me? And that's wildly overgeneral. But the point is, European philosophy tended to be much more abstract. British philosophy is tied to a more scientific approach. And realistically, American philosophy is oriented toward pragmatism. Get it done. What will you pay me? So we don't Descartes' probably the most popular of the continental rationalists. Spinoza and Leibniz don't have a lot of followers. In the 60s, they had a few, but in the 60s, there were a lot of weird things going on with psychedelic music and drugs, too. So, let's move on to... That wasn't meant to be ad hominem. It was meant to be explanatory. British empiricism. The empiricists all said, there are no innate ideas. They said, only particulars exist. That's the second thing. And thirdly, we should seek common sense in observation and practicality. Our intellectual method should seek to be commonsensical, being based on observation and seeking practicality. There are no innate ideas. Do we know that empirically? Uh-oh. The empiricist says everything we know, we know on the basis of sensation. But there are no sensations that will justify there are no innate ideas. Is empiricism presuppositionalist and neutral then? No, empiricism is a dogma, as Quine put it. Not on this particular point, related, but empiricism is prejudiced. It begins with a philosophical assumption, and then after that says no more philosophical assumptions, thank you.
But that's not as sophisticated criticism.
There are no more sophisticated empiricists. I'm not kidding you. There aren't. Well, I am right. There are no more sophisticated empiricists. There still are naive empiricists. They're all in the evangelical church, though. I'm not kidding you. I'm not saying that to be mean. The only people I know that defend naive empiricists are evangelical evidentialists. Some of you are philosophy majors and graduates. Am I putting anybody on? I don't know anybody that defends a kind of pure empiricism anymore. There are people who defend empirical methods as the model of rationality and all. But the idea that there are no innate ideas, people account for innate ideas differently. Conventionalists, linguistic conventionalists, behaviorists, so forth. But you couldn't know anything if there wasn't cognitive background that you bring to your experience. All All observations are theory dependent. And I think that's the reigning view in epistemology today. Secondly, empiricism says only particulars exist. Well, if only particulars exist, notice there can be no unity among the particulars, because unity itself is not a particular. There can't be kinds of things, because a kind of thing, let's say duckness or appleness, a kind of thing is not particular, it's universal. And if there are no connecting principles between things, then we can't even say that an apple is an apple. Because to say that something is an apple is to assume substance, that the properties are united somehow, are indexed together as an apple. But you don't see the indexing of properties. You don't see them united in any conceptual way or even by way of natural laws. Not only is there no substance, if only particulars exist, there can be no causality. Because you can have a particular event and another particular event, but you can't ever say there's a necessary connection between those two events. So you can't ever say anything is causally related. John Locke, the first of the British empiricists that I put up on the board for you, said that the substance that we think about that individuates things and unites properties, substance, he said, is a substratum for qualities. It's something that underlies the qualities, like a pin cushion underlies the pins that are in it. Properties are like pins that are in the substance, the pin cushion. But when pushed, Locke said, openly said, substance is, and I quote, I know not what. That's hyphenated. He wasn't saying, I don't know what substance is. He was saying that. But the point is, substance is a mysterious, metaphysical thing. It's an I know not what. But he felt that he had to have that. Now, in passing about Locke, no innate ideas, but when it came to political theory, this is what Locke is known for by most American school children, right, or high school children anyway. What did Locke teach? The doctrine of, well, private property as an inalienable right. There are no innate ideas, but there are inalienable rights. So if you want a homework assignment, go home tonight and see if you can bring those two together in your worldview. An inalienable right, how can it be inalienable if it's not innate? You know? So it's pretty tough to get all this together. Well, I want to move on though. Locke saw substance as I know not what. Berkeley argued that to be is to be perceived. And therefore there are no abstract ideas, he said. Nothing exists in abstraction. Everything that exists is concrete, and it must be perceived to exist. However, matter is an unperceived abstract idea. Has anybody ever perceived matter? Now don't tell me you've perceived things that are material. That isn't what we're asking. The property of materiality may be there concretely in some things, but the idea of matter is abstract. Material substance is unperceived and therefore doesn't exist. And so according to him, there is no material reality. But what about materiality? I said there's no material reality. What about that property of materiality? Like that, you know. Johnson once thought that he refuted Berkeley by kicking a stone. I mean, that's laughable because if you understand the argument, he didn't deny that we have sensations. But stop and think about it. The stone doesn't have sensations, does it? Why doesn't the stone have sensations? Because it doesn't have a mind. Sensations are interpretations. Okay? And so, in order to have a sensation must be in a mind. So even sensations of materiality are mind-dependent. There is no material reality. All reality is mental reality. And that's why you have this odd combination in Berkeley of a man who is an empiricist but an idealist. He takes empirical presuppositions and pushes them to idealistic conclusions about the nature of reality. Well, Hume comes along and he says, well, I can do you an even greater favor. You've gotten rid of Descartes' material substance. If we're going to be really honest empiricists, we have to get rid of mental substance too. And earlier we talked about this. There's nothing that gives unity to my perceptions. I'm nothing but a bundle of perceptions, and even that's cheating to say that. For Hume, in order for something to exist, it has to be traced to a sensation. That's the empirical approach. No innate ideas are going to help us here. And we never have any sensations of connecting principles between our experiences. We don't have any psychological connecting principles, and therefore there's no me, there's no continuing personal identity, and we don't have any perception of physical connecting principles, and therefore there's no causation in the world. There's just one random event followed by another random event. Every experience is a separate, isolated unit of consciousness. There's no necessity in the world of thought or experience, sensation, and there's no necessity in the world that is outside the mind. And so there's no basis for a knowledge of the external world of enduring objects, no basis for a knowledge of causality among objects, nor is there a continuing self that could know the causation between objects. Now, what would you call this view if you wanted to just choose a term out of the history of philosophy? How about skepticism? Boy, that's radical. How did Hume deal with the skepticism? Yeah, well, actually, he said when he gets working on these problems and they really get him down, he stops and he plays backgammon with his friends. I'm so glad that he said that. He must have thought he was being real smarty, to say that sort of thing. But that is such an honest admission. That's our culture, my friends. When you get tired of the philosophical problems Monday through Friday, at the SC Philosophy Hall, you go home and party. That's what you do. You go to football games and watch movies and think about your kids, and then you go back on Monday and start all over again. It's two different worlds, and they cannot be brought together. Hume admitted that we do think causally, but he said there's no rational basis for it. That's why he's a skeptic.
So why didn't you just stop?
Stop what? Why? Wouldn't you rather go home and party and go to football games and stuff?
It just seems to me it would be so obvious to him that what he's doing contradicts what he's teaching.
Contradicts in a world where there's no connections between things? Now, I'm not putting you on. I'm trying to help you see what Hume would be able to say and what unbelievers say. When you challenge unbelieving philosophers today about these things, and you get them all balled up intellectually, they're essentially going to cop out on you like that. You're going to say, well, why don't you live, you're using Christian presuppositions, why don't you live consistent with your philosophy? And their answer is, there's no consistency anyway, so why worry about it? I do what pleases me. And it pleases me to continue living, to enjoy a little bit of Jack Daniels and, the party lifestyle or whatever, and then to make a living telling students you can't make any sense out of anything. I'm overgeneralizing, but not terribly. Our assumption is people are going to live in terms of their philosophy. Their assumption is we have no moral obligations at all. Not even a moral obligation to live in terms of our philosophy. And this is a perverse kind of consistency, but do you see the consistency of the unbeliever? I want to tie this in with Van Til. Van Til says if you're going to play the explanation-giving game, you have to be a Christian. And you want an explanation for why you believe one thing and you do another. And basically what he's going to say is, there is no explanation.
There are reasons why when you mentioned the empiricists, when I went to school, they taught, they gave the unreliability of sense data. You have a hot bowl of water, cold bowl of water, you put your hands in both. Then you put it in the third common ball and it feels hot for one, feels cold for the other.
Right.
What you didn't bring up when you in your quick critique stuff that you have three. You didn't bring up the other liability stuff. That would you if you had more time?
Yes. I mean, you have to kind of order, you think, the most devastating criticisms down to the, and I would say that is a little below midway. That's not the most telling criticism. But well, but you see, the answer to that is you need an objective way of measuring, quote unquote, not a subjective way of measuring. And that's why we have thermometers, exactly. I mean, there's other problems about, what's that? How do I come back to it?
So we'll say, okay, yeah, well, we get an objective measure with sensation, an independent thing. And so, in other words, what they're trying to cut, the way they're trying to answer that is, oh, yes, there is an independent objective standard for sensation. Is that what they're trying to do, I guess?
Yes.
Oh, it's obviously the thermometer.
Yeah, they are. But again, no sophisticated philosopher uses that argument. You know why? I mean, think about it, Bill. If I'm going to be a radical, I mean, it's fun being a radical skeptic. Now I'm going to say, what's the connection between the measurement on the thermometer in this hand and this hand? Obviously, what you have here is three different measurements, and there's no connection between them. Yeah, exactly. See, they're assuming that if we can depersonalize it, that makes it objective. But now there's what's the relationship between the impersonal and the personal measuring devices? Okay? The problem in epistemology is the problem of perspectival variation. Okay, you're out on the lake and you have your oars, you're rowing on the lake, and you look in the water at the oar, what do you see? You see a bent oar, don't you? Because of the refraction of light in the water. But then you say, wow, what happened to that oar? And you put your hand in the water and you skim down the oar and you say, no, it feels straight. So you look at it and it's broken, not broken, but bent. You touch it and it feels straight. And you say, oh, okay, well, that solves it. That solves it only if you arbitrarily exalt tactile sense over visual sense, right? Yeah, exactly. So there are problems with empiricism, but I think these are more like mosquito bites over against the hammer blows of what Hume was doing here. Okay, so now to appreciate Kant, you can see that the age of reason, why would philosophers call it such a thing? The age of reason ended in subjectivism and skepticism, didn't it? Whether you're a rationalist or an empiricist. And that led to a collapse of confidence in man's intellectual ability and the objectivity of knowledge, particularly the objectivity of knowledge of a real, orderly world. Neither the rationalist nor the empiricist were able to find a reliable method of knowing. And it turns out that there's huge disagreements over this instrument called reason and what reason is supposed to be. You know, it's one thing for the unbelieving world to say, we exalt reason. In the French Revolution, you remember, the goddess of reason was exalted. You know, but if you were an analytical philosopher, you'd say, what are you talking about when you speak of reason? You're talking about reason as Spinoza understood it? Leibniz? Berkeley? Locke? Hume? Who? What is reason in the age of reason? Well, it's a zillion different things. And Kant was scandalized by that.
Now, you said the age of reason collapsed into what?
Skepticism. No, subjectivism and skepticism. Does that sound like a familiar tag team?
Yeah, right.
Okay.
You said earlier, talking about continental rationalism, that reality equals rationality, is that it? Reality is rational.
Yes. And now we have rational men disagreeing with each other about reality.
Right, so it's really it's the particular rationalist determining what reality is.
Yeah, so it's subjective, which reduces to skepticism. And why do they keep having this problem? Because their fundamental assumption is the autonomy of man. They began with man as the reference point and the final authority. In the way philosophy is taught in secular, even in Christian schools, but the way philosophy is taught, It's as though, well, to do philosophy, you have to assume that. I mean, that's just, you're not doing philosophy if you don't do that. So when we suggest, well, maybe you ought to begin with the theological presupposition, with God, who is the creator of man, rather than with man who then goes out to discover God. But if you suggest that today, you'll be told, I think almost invariably, you'll be told you're not doing philosophy, you're doing theology. And we all know how disreputable theology is. Well, I don't wince too much when they say that. I say, yeah, the only thing is my theology can save your philosophy, so maybe we ought to talk a bit more. Okay, Kant, finally. Kant was scandalized by the situation in philosophy. You have these rationalists and you have these empiricists, and they both reduced to subjectivism and skepticism. In particular, he wrote that he was awakened from his dogmatic slumbers by Hume. And Kant was led to alter the view of reason that he had previously held. That's why the title of his book, his best-known book, most important book, I think, is A Critique of Pure Reason. Kant's philosophy is sometimes called critical philosophy. He wrote The Critique of Pure Reason in 1781, which is a very obscure and prolix book, but is still considered his masterpiece. The Critique of Practical Reason in 1788, and then The Critique of Judgment in 1790. And so when you write enough books that have the title critique in it, you get to call your philosophy critical philosophy. Kant was awakened from his dogmatic slumbers, came to a new view of reason. Such a new view of reason that he said it amounted to a Copernican revolution in philosophy. A Copernican revolution. You all know what the Copernican revolution is? Someone fill me in, quick. Rich? What?
Heliocentric view of the universe opposed to
Geocentric, yeah. And so the geocentric view, which had been promoted by, well, but before him, Ptolemy, had dominated until Copernicus, making use of the telescope and other instruments, said we really have to reorient the way we look at things. It's not that the Earth is stationary, let's say passive, and everything is active around it. Is that the Earth is active and is actually going around the stationary object, the sun. Likewise, Kant said Locke was wrong to think the mind is passive. The mind is active. In order to make sense out of our thoughts, the mind has got to make them sensible. Not only sensible, but intelligible. And how does the mind make them sensible? It always attributes to those sensations coming in time and space predicates. The mind actively imposes order on the chaos of the world that we encounter. Of course, I'm assuming it's a world out there. Basically, Kant said there are things in themselves and we know nothing about them. We don't know the way things are as they really are in and of themselves. We only know them as we experience them. But as we experience them, we impose temporal and spatial characteristics. We impose order on our sensations. Not only do we make our sensations sensible, part of time and space, but we also make them intelligible because we have to categorize them. Our sensations have to be formed as things that are understood causally, substantially, numerically, and so forth. So Kant goes through in the critique an argument for all these different categories in terms of which we must think. Hume had gotten rid of causation in inductive reasoning, saying we don't ever observe it. If our minds are passive and we only know what impinges on our minds, causation's never impinged on our mind because nothing necessary, well, to put it simply, nothing necessary can be particular, and we only sense particular things. So we can't ever have a sensation of causation or of substance. Kant said, and Hume's final word is, that's just the habit of the mind. Kant says, I can save science, I can save causation, I can save substance. Oh, how's that? Kant says, it's a habit of the mind. Don't you get it? I mean, I'm not being cutesy here. That's an old philosopher's joke. Basically, Kant took Hume's despairing conclusion and made it the answer to Hume's skepticism. Hume said, the only reason we draw causal connections is because we're in the habit of doing it. It's a mental habit. Of course, he can't account for habits, given his view of man and so forth. But Kant takes that and says, well, the mind itself imposes actively causal categories in everything. And that's why if you talk about God, you have to, if God's going to be intelligible to us, we have to ask, where does God come from? Now, Kant also had a portion of his critique that he reserved for the categories of God, world, and self. And on these, he said, though we have to think in terms of these other categories of substance and cause, we can't draw conclusions from them. They are only limiting notions. The only God that could be intelligible to us would have to be a God that has a cause, but we know better than to say that. God can't have a cause. So that's just a way of thinking by which we limit all of our causal reasoning, and then we stop and we call that God. But we don't really intelligently or intelligibly know God. For Kant, God was part of the noumenal realm. God exists as a thing in itself, and we can't know God. We can only know God as he would appear to us, and God would have to appear to us in categories amenable to our way of thinking. Our way of thinking is causal, therefore God can't appear to us in miraculous way. Because for us to think rationally about anything is to reject miracles. Okay? Now, this is all very wicked stuff, but it's also extremely entertaining and clever. What's it rest on? Rest on the assumption that we don't know the objective world. We only know the internal phenomenal world, the world as it's experienced by us. And since that world is itself formed, made intelligible by the activity of the mind, then naturally what we think is necessary. And what we think in terms of the categories is necessary. Necessary by what? Psychological habit. So Kant said against rationalism, there are no innate ideas. According to him, nothing can be known rationally apart from experience. So he's against the rationalist. He favors the empiricist on this one. There are no innate ideas. The mind doesn't have ideas in it inherently. But against empiricism, the mind is not a tabula rasa. The mind is not passive. It is rather a constructive, active agent. So that what we know is to be attributed not just to the world outside us, but is to be attributed to the activity of the mind in constructing a world that is intelligible to us. And so to use the famous line for which Kant is known, concepts without percepts are empty, percepts without concepts are blind. If you only have perceptions and they are not made intelligible by the concepts, they're blind. But if you only have concepts, like causation, substance, whatever, without perceptions, then they'll be empty. Kant claimed to save science and to make room for faith in this philosophy. How did he save science? Well, he resurrected the causal principle, the principle of unity between perceptions as a substance, and so forth. That's a strange way of saving science, though, because he saved science by claiming that the objects of knowledge must conform to the knowing process. The objects of knowledge. I don't believe in conspiracies. Okay. So essentially, Kant saves science by subjectivizing it. Science becomes a necessity of our subjective thinking process. I quote Kant again, "The understanding is itself the lawgiver of nature." The understanding itself is the lawgiver of nature. So do we find natural laws? Sure we do. But that's because the understanding imposes those laws. Kant was, accordingly, a metaphysical agnostic. He didn't know reality, and yet he held to the certainty of the knowing process, and he did so by subjectivizing it. Now, what did we say earlier when philosophies are reduced to subjectivism? Yeah. Essentially, Kant, for all of his transcendental thought, for what he was attempting to do, Kant himself succumbs to skepticism as well. If nothing else, Kant doesn't ever get beyond what's called the egocentric predicament. Because if Kant is right about how his mind must think in a certain way, Kant doesn't show us that all minds must think in that way. He thought he did, but he didn't. Much more, he did not show that if all minds must think this way, that the objects outside the mind must be like that. Kant called his position transcendental idealism. And the reason he used that language is that he said, a transcendental is what is presupposed by experience in order for it to be experienced. Or I think it's easier to say, it's what's presupposed for an experience to be intelligible. Experience is automatically intelligible for Kant because experience is formed by the mind. Okay? So outside of Kantian thinking, we would say an experience, let's say some kind of input to our senses, is intelligible on certain presuppositions. And those presuppositions are the transcendentals. Transcendental analysis thus asks, what are the preconditions for the intelligibility of human experience? Or under what conditions is it possible to make sense of the world or to experience, rationally to experience the world? Why don't we just stop our Christian apologetical search with Kant then? I mean, he was so smart to get onto this transcendental approach. Why aren't we satisfied with Kant's transcendental analysis? Well, I've already indicated to you, well, Kant's transcendental analysis is subjective. It doesn't really give us any metaphysical information. Kant's transcendental analysis is psychological and assumes, without any warrant, the universal psychological operations of men. How did he think he proved what?
That all our minds are what you're saying.
Well, interpreters will differ with you as to how Kant would answer that. Basically, Kant said, you're not talking about thinking if they don't do what I'm telling you. Now, well, okay. But now, is that a linguistic convention? Is that what he was getting at? Or was he trying to objectify psychological processes without any metaphysical bridge? I mean, it's questionable, how Kant would have gotten out of the dilemma. But Kant himself thought that in the nature of the case, that's what thinking is. I mean, he thought he was analyzing thinking per se. It's a critique of pure reason. And so if you're going to talk about reason, you're talking about what I'm talking about. I know that's frustrating. Part of being able to get a PhD in philosophy is to endure a lot of frustration. It comes down to this: how do you interpret that reply? Is Kant saying we're not using terms in the same way, so we don't have the same conceptual scheme? Is he a cultural relativist? Well, probably not. But on the other hand, he wasn't trying to make some kind of empirical psychological observation for which he didn't have sufficient evidence. So I don't know. Anybody, any Kantians, any Kant scholars out there want to offer anything better? Mike? No? Well,
You know the saying, causation is a habit of the mind. And Kant's contemplated, that's real science, but I'll say that it's a habit of the mind. But the fact that everyone seems to have the same habit of mind, does he feel a need to explain that?
no, I think that's one of his unexamined assumptions. And so although this is supposed to be a critique, which means you come clean down to your underwear intellectually, Kant left some things unexamined.
I mean, he did say, he tried to justify it with transcendental arguments, showing that these concepts are a necessary precondition for our experience and the way we view the world. And from that, you conclude that. I mean, I think implicit in his whole discussion is there's no other way of conceiving of the world. You can't conceive of the world without causation. I mean, that's intertwined with his arguments and the deduction that you have to view the world through the prisms of causation. You have to view the world through the prisms of substance. We can't make the world conceptual scheme intelligible without those types of things. So to him, I mean, it's just like that's one thing. Definition, that's what thinking is. To not have that type of stuff in your conceptual scheme is not to have. He didn't use conceptual scheme language, mind you, but to not have those things within your conceptual scheme is not to have one at all. And not to have one at all is not to be able to think.
Yeah. According to Kant, reality could not be understood by a single, unified, common set of principles. To understand nature, you have to use causal principles. Now, I have not talked about this next thing, but I'm just putting it out there for you. But to understand morality and human personality, you have to use principles of freedom. And so according to him, even on his own approach, there are two wonders, the starry heavens above and the moral law within, and you can't bring them together. Now, that's poetic language, but what he says, the way you understand the physical cosmos will not help you understand the moral law. And the way you understand the moral law, freedom, will not help you understand the physical cosmos. Physical cosmos is governed by causation, determinism, okay? But morality presupposes freedom, indeterminism. And Kant admitted that and left it out there. So does he have a unified worldview? No, he doesn't have one at all. So I don't think his transcendental arguments saved science as he thought, because they really succumb to subjectivism. And he doesn't save philosophy in general because he doesn't have a common principle by which you can account for things or give explanation. There's two kinds of explanations, and you never can bring them together. And then one more comment about Kant, just so you'll understand why us Van Tillians like what he was trying to do but don't like the way he did it. Did Kant save human personality, the unity of the person? Hume said, I'm only a bundle of perceptions. And twice I've now indicated or more, he doesn't even have the right to say bundle, because bundle assumes unity, and he doesn't see any unity there. But anyway, he knew there was no connection on his philosophy between the perceptions, so there couldn't be any person to have the experience. Now, Kant realizes that's devastating, and that destroys the ability to know anything. And so Kant argues that there must be a unity of thinking, a subject who thinks. But according to him, that subject cannot be known observationally, obviously. By the way, having mirrors doesn't help this problem, because you're not you may observe a physical body in the mirror, but you're not observing, to use Descartes' language, the mind that experiences and unites all of those experiences. Kant says you do have to have a subject of thinking, but that subject of thinking cannot be known observationally. The subject of thinking can only be known through its thinking. That is, we only know ourselves in the act of knowing. And in that case, in knowing myself, Kant says, I only know a place, well, I'm using my language, a place marker. The human person is diaphanous. When I look at myself, not my body, but when I look at myself as a knower, I'm really looking through me. Because the only me there is this place marker for all of these experiences that are coming in. So we don't find that an adequate apologetic, to be real obvious. God cannot be known because God is in the noumenal realm. Any God that you could rationally know would have to be subject to scientific determinism, no miracles, etc., etc. The only God that you could know would be a God that stands behind the moral law as a limiting notion that there'll be a day of judgment if we don't live up to the rational moral law within us. But that moral law can't be related to the world that we know rationally about us either. So he has a dichotomy in his philosophy. And then finally, we don't even know ourselves except as there's a philosophical necessity for something to unite apperception. Kant's word was there's a transcendental unity of apperception. We must think of ourselves as having perceptions. It's a transcendental necessity. But that unity is diaphanous. It doesn't have any content, any detail. It's essentially a function, a place marker in our thinking.
Is that his own word? Are you paraphrasing?
The expression...
That sounds like a cop-out. That unity, this diaphanous place marker.
I don't think Kant was real proud of that in the sense that he had come up with something grand. I think he would just say that's the way it is. The point is, with that, I can save rationality. Okay, having introduced Kant in his context, let me bring you up to date now and put transcendental arguments in the context of modern philosophical argument. I have a little chart here that I've worked out so you'll have some appreciation and understanding of what's distinctive about the transcendental approach. In the case of Kant, we see that the transcendental approach is distinct because he's not looking for observations to justify his philosophy. He's not an empiricist. But nor is he trying to look for clear and distinct ideas from which he can deduce the nature of reality. He's not a rationalist. He's not doing the rational game, the empiricist game. He's asking, what else must be true in order to make sense out of my thinking as a scientist, my thinking as a logician, or whatever it may be. He's asking for the presuppositions of the intelligibility of any experience whatsoever. Now, in modern epistemology, you can think of the strategies in the theory of knowledge as being responses, various responses to skepticism. The reason why we need a theory of knowledge is because there are skeptics, basically. It's possible to ask skeptical questions about what we know. Now, when we answer questions on how we know what we know, we get pushed back to assumptions that we've been using. And then the skeptic is going to say, how do you know about those assumptions? And then that may push you back further. But eventually, we reach, in every school of philosophy, what will be called fundamental assumptions. Can your fundamental assumptions be justified? Can they be rationally justified? And in the literature, this sometimes is put in this form, can rationality be justified? Because you've been trying to show the skeptic, here's how I know what I know, and you've gone through various levels of assumptions. You get down to the bottom, can this rational procedure that you've been using itself be justified? And the answer of the skeptic is no. Fundamental assumptions cannot be rationally justified, and therefore all belief systems are ultimately arbitrary. Because the standards of justification also need justification if you're going to be rational, you'll either have an infinite regress of justifications or you'll reach some level of commitment that is not rational. So that's the horns of the dilemma. The skeptic's argument is you're either going to have an infinite regress, rational justification with another rational justification behind it, and then another rational justification, and that's going to go on and on and on, in which case nothing ever gets rationally justified. Or you're going to stop your appeal to rational justifications and you're going to have a commitment that's not rational. And therefore rationality itself is not justified. Now, if the skeptic cannot be answered, then we've given way to intellectual anarchy or dogmatism. Anarchy says everything's relative, no one can know for sure, and everyone has the right to believe what they believe, and therefore to do what they want to do. This is where we cross the fine line between academic or intellectual sophistication and the playing out of worldviews. Students who are anarchist in their view of literature, philosophy, ethics, don't tend to live lives that are not anarchistic, where every man's a law unto himself. Dogmatism, we already talked about earlier, is the view that you just come down to power plays. You have usually institutional restraints on what can be said or believed or lived out. So you have skepticism needing an answer, if we're going to save rationality. And the attempts to meet the skeptical challenge can be divided into three on my outline, and then there's going to be some subdivisions. First of all, there's the foundationalist attempt. Foundationalism unites together various epistemologies which want to eliminate arbitrariness in our thinking, want to eliminate prejudice, relativism, unwarranted conjecture, and attempt to obtain cognitive certainty that's not just a kind of psychological assurance. And the way in which we get cognitive certainty, according to foundationalist epistemologies, is to anchor our beliefs in some kind of a foundation of propositions which are themselves unassailable. And then from that foundation, we conduct intellectual inquiries according to some strict rules of reliable method for reasoning. And we don't admit into our belief system any proposition that hasn't been certified by its connection to the foundation or other foundationally certified beliefs. And in that way, we can guarantee ourselves an accurate depiction of the world. We've used the term you may not be familiar with in calling this foundationalism, but you're all familiar with this way of thinking. I think this is pretty much the naive approach to epistemology most everybody takes. It's like, if I know this, then this is founded on this, and this is founded on that, and eventually I get down to the foundation for all of these beliefs, and they're built up by some kind of strict method. We may not agree on what that method is, but first we have foundations, then we have reliable method, and we can be assured the skeptic is wrong. We have an accurate depiction of the world. And the foundationalist that I want you to get into your outline, the most important kinds of foundationalism are conceptual or logical, perceptual, and then finally common sense foundations. A logical foundationalist holds that the standards by which we judge everything are the rules of logic. Now, unfortunately, the rules of logic are purely formal. And so if that's the only foundation you have, the only knowledge you can get is knowledge which is going to be formalized. It's going to be consistent, but it won't have any details from experience, anything that we know about the world. Perceptual foundationalism holds in one form or another, this is the more empirical approach, that ultimately everything we know needs to be traced back to some kind of perception, the perception thought to be infallible. Of course, that's not accurate. Our perceptions are not infallible. Our perceptions are at best incorrigible. Maybe I can't deny the way I see things, but I can't argue that the way I see things is the way they actually are. And so perceptual foundationalism hits the rocks pretty hard. I mean, the naive empirical approach to epistemology hasn't fared real well, and even its modern advocates, the logical positivist and others, have reduced themselves to self-contradiction and the inability to talk about their own philosophy. And so you can understand the sympathy that many people have then for common sense foundationalism. The common sense approach can be divided into two different ways of seeing common sense. One says it makes no sense to question the rationality of our standards of rationality. Since we accept these as the standards of rationality by common sense, it makes no sense to now question them. The more popular version of common sense philosophy, however, has been conventionalism, usually linguistic conventionalism. The standards that we call commonsensical are part of a form of life with which, in terms of which we've grown up, learned to use language and so forth. Well, common sense, you don't have to be a sophisticated student of philosophy to see through that. You know, one man's common sense is another man's absurdity, isn't it? And when you run into people who don't accept what you call common sense, as I said earlier, Wittgenstein said all you can do is yell heretic. I like Wittgenstein in that, he knew what he was getting at there. He said, there's no reasoning between these things. These are forms of life. What could I say to somebody who believes something as absurd as that? All I could say is, you're a heretic. Can't reason with you. I can just dogmatically dismiss you. That's nonsense to talk that way. Okay. Foundationalism hasn't fared well. It's not very popular in our days. There are some people who defend it in the common sense and perceptual forms, but not many.
Who are they?
Well, I'll give you a list of them. Actually, if you want to get my article, what's the title of it?
Constructivism. That's 3 words on it. That one.
No, it's the one on the nature of science, and whether science is objective and invariant. Say it again.
Science, subjectivity, and presuppositionalism.
You were right. It had 3 words in it. I'm sorry, Bill. Science, subjectivity, and presuppositionalism. And I give a list of some of the major players in epistemology today, okay? Sellers is the one that I know best, perceptual foundationalism, defending it today. And you have G.E. Moore and Wittgenstein in terms of common sense or linguistic conventionalism and so forth.
But Christians like this in evidential.
Oh, yes.
William Olson is Christian. He holds some form of I call it a empirical, perceptual type of foundationalism.
Okay. And Alston's a good philosopher in terms of knowing his stuff. I don't have to agree with him to, honor his ability. But among evangelical apologists, most tend to be foundationalist. And you'll have Gordon Clark, who early in his career was a logical foundationalist. Coherence is the test. And then you have the evidentialists like Montgomery and others who are empirically, or they would be perceptual. I say that because ultimately that's what it has to be. The problem is I'm not sure they've thought enough through their theory of knowledge to even know where they fit on the scale here. Maybe I'm being too insulting. I don't mean to be, but they eventually are perceptual foundationalists. They believe that observation is the basis for what we know.
So the point to historical archaeology.
Right. What we've learned through science. And that leads me to the next way to deal with skepticism, and that's pragmatism. And I'm grouping together, in my way of cutting the cake, this may not be the best way, but it helps me. I'm grouping together under pragmatism two different ways of dealing. They're related, but they are distinct as well. Two ways of dealing with the skeptical challenge. The first one says we deal with skepticism by referring in some way, in some normative way, to the model of science. The logic of scientific inquiry becomes the paradigm of rationality. And the reason why the skeptic ought to accede to this model of rationality is that it's the most potentially true and potentially successful way to organize our lives intellectually. So when we study science, I mean, all of us are awed by science, right? Look at its accomplishments. Look at its intellectual restraints, so forth. And so the logic of scientific inquiry is the paradigm of rationality. Now, the difficulty with this is that regardless of what you think of science and its accomplishments, the presuppositions of science must first be defended before science itself is a rational answer to the skeptic. And the general organizing principles of experience, that is the way in which all of our experience is organized, interpreted, and made intelligible, those principles are not appraised by experience itself. And so science, resting on experience and observation, is itself assuming some organizing principles that cannot be scientifically verified or made sense of. They are not themselves appraised by experience. Moreover, whenever you start talking about the model of science, you're going to be embarrassed by two things. First, there have been plenty of cultures, both simultaneous to our own and previous to our own, that did not follow what we call scientific procedure, but we would call them rational people. To say that what we do today in the natural sciences is the model of science assumes that everybody who did things in a way different than we do them now was irrational. They were irrational. And that's, of course, that's nothing more but cultural prejudice talk that way. And so what is it that we have in common with those previous cultures that were rational but didn't do things in the way that we organized them scientifically at the university? And the other thing, and this is the scandal, I think, of those who try to answer the skeptic by the model of science, is there is no model of science.
Introductory science was
Oh, yeah. I mean, this is what high school students get, and even, as you say, at the college level, introductory books of science. And that's because the winners in the scientific revolution write the textbooks. And they impose them politically, by the way. I mean that literally, as to what can and cannot be said and so forth. But the more you study science, its history, and also its present operation, in the first place, there's no agreement within a narrow field of science. If there were, you wouldn't have the O.J. Simpson trial with all the experts, competing with each other. And you know what the judge has to do there? Notice this. This is fascinating. He has to decide who is scientifically credible. And I'm not putting Judge Ito down. Does Judge Ito have the standards of rationality to decide who's really doing genuine science and who's engaged in quackery? That's a scary thing, isn't it? That's what happens if you say the model of science. I mean, whose model of science? And it's worse than this, though. It's not just that you have different and competing schools of science within a narrow domain. You don't have one scientific procedure used by all the sciences. That is extremely naive to say. As Gilbert Ryle once said, there's no one science. There are many sciences, all of which are rational. But it's hard to say, to use a Wittgensteinian phrase, you'd have to say, at best, what makes each of them rational is some kind of family resemblance. But there's no one thing, there's no standard move in argumentation among all the sciences. And so you look at the way a particular domain in science reasons, what kinds of backings for argument, what kinds of warrants are used, what argument forms are followed, and they are not the same as what you find in another science. And so psychologists and physicists and astronomers and historians are all doing science, and they're all trying to be rational, but they don't use a common method. So there are many sciences. The other pragmatic answer to the skeptic, apart from the model of science approach, is the appeal to the success of science or the fruitfulness of science. We can't answer the skeptic ultimately, but we can point to the fruitfulness of science as attaining its goals. Okay, now the question that has to be asked, though, if you're a skeptic or just trying to be an honest philosopher, is, are the goals of science rational? The problem didn't go away, it just got rephrased. Are the ultimate assumptions of science rational? Can rationality itself be justified? The pragmatist says, well, it's certainly fruitful. I say, okay, but is your fruitfulness rational? Well, it achieves its ends. We're very effective at reaching our goals. Okay, which goal should we be pursuing? Please don't think that that's an easy thing to answer. Among the pragmatists in our day, there's all kinds of differences of opinion. Are we supposed to preserve the species? Is that what it is that makes us rational?
In other words, it's arbitrary.
It's arbitrary because they're choosing the consequence that they want to achieve. But what should we achieve? Should it be an economic consequence, as Marxists say? Should it be something having to do with the environment? Should it be social egalitarianism? I mean, there's all sorts of things people are striving for. What's that? Oh, yeah, that's right. Some. They aren't usually, warmly welcomed among the pragmatists, but that would be another one. Pragmatism assumes that we know what is the one rational end we should be achieving. Well, they have no justification for that. There are rivals to the idea of adjusting to our environment or saving the species or bringing social, equality in terms of what we should be pragmatically pursuing. Well, we're getting to the end of our day, probably to the end of our ability to think anymore. What are we going to do if the foundationalist and the pragmatist are not able to answer the skeptic? Well, there's one more form of reasoning, and this is getting back to what Immanuel Kant introduced to us in terms of a procedure or a way of approaching it. He didn't successfully do it, I don't think. But the third way in which the skeptic can be met is to offer a transcendental argument. And the transcendental argument takes the form of saying that we know something is true from the impossibility of the contrary. That's one way of putting it. Or what we're looking for is the precondition for the intelligibility of experience. We say there are certain things we know to be true because those things are the precondition or the presupposition for intelligibility. So now the skeptic can keep blathering all he wants, but our point is, as long as you want to argue, Mr. Skeptic, you're presupposing the intelligibility of what you're saying. And so you've been met on your own ground, and it turns out you can't pursue your skeptical argument without this metaphysic or worldview in terms of which your language, your argument can make sense. Okay? Hopefully this gives you something of a map for the landscape of modern epistemology. It doesn't tell you everything by any means, but the big hills should be easy to see. You have the skeptic, who is really the troublemaker among us all, and the skeptic is going to be answered either in a foundationalist, pragmatic, or transcendental fashion. How does this apply to my opening statement this morning? I believe there's an objective proof for God's existence. Well, we have skeptics out there, religious skeptics and other kinds, right? They say, we can't know these things. Some Christians say, let's try to satisfy the skeptic with foundational answers. Others are willing to say Christianity works the best, and this is really the model for how to live your life. Yet others will say we can meet the skeptic by saying that even your argument presupposes the truth of what we believe, because without what we believe, your argument wouldn't be intelligible. That's the strength of the transcendental approach. When we regather in the morning, I'm going to ask Mike Butler to take our morning session, and if he needs some more time, a little more after, but at least our morning session. and go over modern transcendental arguments and what are some of the issues that are involved there. So tonight, if you wish to prepare for that, make sure you look at the, everybody received in the mail, I think, an encyclopedia entry on transcendental arguments. And I know it's not the easiest reading, but go back and read Kant. You were also sent that material. Go slow. That's very well written. I thought that was very helpful. And then the material on transcendental arguments, so you'll be able to enter into Mike's discussion. Thanks a lot.
This recording has been released into the public domain by the Bahnsen Institute. Duplication, sharing, and distribution is encouraged. For more information about the life and ministry of Dr. Greg L. Bahnsen, visit our website, bahnseninstitute.com, where we aim to bring into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. This recording has been released into the public domain by the Bahnsen Institute, where we aim to bring into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ.
Everybody back on this, our second day, a seminar on transcendental arguments. I began yesterday with the opening salvo that I believe that the existence of God is objectively provable. And then I took that and started to do an analysis and to try to qualify and explain what I'm getting at. And we took a while to talk about the notion of proof. When I say objectively provable, what am I getting at? By a proof that is objective, not interested in the man or the source of opinion or how people personally respond and so forth. We're talking about proof, not persuasion. We're recognizing the difference between metaphysics, what is the case, and epistemology, how people think and what they believe and how they know and things of that nature. And then after we discussed the notion of proof, we began to look at the kinds of proofs that would be available. The cosmological proof was taken as our stalking horse. And I said the cosmological proof is bad as a proof. It's really bad philosophically as proof. However, there is something to that, this notion of causation, that if you go back and now do a transcendental analysis of it, does turn out to be, I think, a very strong proof of the existence of God. And so now we have the notion of transcendental proof. We've talked in our early discussion of proofs about rational proofs, rationalistic, empirical or empiricalistic proofs, pragmatic proofs, and then transcendental. After we introduced Van Til, both the easy illustration from Why I Believe in God, and then going to his first syllabus, more technically precise, his philosophical description of transcendental argument, we went back and looked at the history of philosophy to put Immanuel Kant in context. The reason for that is that Kant's the one who in the modern world has brought such attention to this idea of transcendental analysis or argumentation. So we studied the continental rationalist briefly and the British empiricist, and we saw that they both, for all their differences, end up with the same problem. Kant was scandalized by that and suggested a program for answering the problem or solving the problem. I don't believe Kant solved the problem, but I do believe that the program, what he tried to do, his strategy, was the right strategy. And so at the end of yesterday's session, I tried to put modern epistemological approaches into context for you. I said epistemology is stimulated by the skeptic's challenge. The skeptic says rationality itself is not justified. And then there are all sorts of differences among epistemologists, no doubt about that. But the way in which you respond to skepticism is going to fall into one of three schools of thought, at least in the 20th century, and I don't think anybody's going to be creative enough to come up with something that doesn't fit this pattern. You're either going to be a foundationalist, you're going to argue, well, there are some things which are indubitable, be they logical or conceptual, perceptual, or a matter of common sense. or you're going to kind of skirt this whole thing and say, we're not going to try to argue this way. We'll be pragmatic about it. We'll just talk about what is fruitful and brings success, or what is the model of science, the most rational way to approach things. Or finally, you're going to be transcendental in your analysis or response to skepticism. And the transcendentalist, as you know, the heart of that is to say the skeptic can't even formulate his argument without denying what he's trying to prove. Okay, and so foundationalism, pragmatism, transcendental analysis are the three responses to skepticism, and that's what I left you with yesterday. Now, after we were done, because Randy's staying with me, we get to have extended conversations about all this. Randy ran past me. He said, now let me just give you, this is the summary by Bubba, right? I'm stealing his thunder. Randy, when he speaks with me at our apologetics conference on Van Til, he follows me and then he makes fun of me by saying, now I'm going to explain it for Bubba. Anyway, Bubba gave me his boil down of yesterday's presentation. I thought it was so much better than what I said. I thought, I'll let Randy give you the summary. I think those of you who were struggling a bit yesterday will appreciate. I'm going to let Randy give it in his words, and then we're going to turn things over to Mike. Go ahead.
Okay. As a pastor, a lot of times I just think about how I might present some of this material when I get back home to the congregation. And what I did in the summary was not just, or I did not cover the issues relating to what Dr. Van Til is going to present, because we're going to be going into more detail with that. But what was new to me, not being a philosophy student, were the things that were mentioned regarding autonomous philosophy and how they've gone about trying to answer the big questions. And just, again, this is just a summary of a lot of which Dr. Bonson has just covered. But the four general kinds of reasoning that autonomous man has offered to these problems of the rationalist, the empiricist, the pragmatist, and then the transcendental argument. And those are the four attempts made to offer proof for understanding our experience in the world that we live in. The problem with all of those, with unbelieving thought, and to me this was the key point that's going to give us our breakdown, is that he always starts with himself. And when he starts with himself, autonomous man's reasoning leads him in a vicious circle. Dr. Van Til, I believe, said that all reasoning is circular reasoning, and the problem with autonomous reasoning is that it reasons in a vicious circle. It starts with man, and it always has to end with man, and since it ends with man, that led us to the themes that we kept hearing yesterday, and that is we're left with subjectivism. That is that we're left with really each man has his own opinion about understanding reality. And since that's true, there's no authoritative opinion. You have yours, I have mine. Each man has his own position. That leads to skepticism. We really can't know anything for sure. And so from that, there were three attempts to answer skepticism. That is, the foundationalist attempts to answer. The pragmatist and the transcendentalist seeks to provide a foundation or an answer to the skeptic. And again, one other key point that to me was important for us to remember as we deal with Dr. Van Til is that Kant, who's the transcendentalist, was asking the right questions. He just didn't get the right answers, and the reason he didn't get the right answers is he made the same mistake the others did. He started with man. He started with autonomous man and seeking to find the preconditions for intelligibility. And so what's going to happen here with Dr. Van Til is going to say, we've got the right question. Now let's have a different starting point. We're not going to start with autonomous man. So I hope that provides some hook to go with here in understanding why we want to consider the transcendental argument.
Well, this morning I've been asked to address the issue of contemporary developments in transcendental arguments. And I know I shouldn't start off like this, but I have to warn you that it's going to be a bit difficult. I'm going to try to make it as simple as possible, and probably will need Randy to come back tomorrow and explain it again better than I did. But hopefully we could pick up something from the contemporary debate and apply it to Van Tillian transcendental arguments and see how they affect, how the current debate affects our view of transcendental arguments, Van Til's view of transcendental arguments, and see if in any way the criticisms leveled against contemporary transcendental arguments apply to Van Tillian transcendental arguments. Now let me just give you the layout of the land as we approach the issue of contemporary transcendental arguments. And I should explain what I mean by contemporary transcendental arguments are those that have been prevalent in the philosophical literature for the last 50 years or so. So within the last 50 years, there's been somewhat, actually 40 years is more close to the number. But in the last 40 years, there's been a resurgence in philosophy in the interest of transcendental arguments. Now, most philosophers today don't believe that transcendental arguments are any good. The majority report in American and British philosophy is that transcendental arguments are somehow spurious in one way or another. But there have been some proponents who have tried to make a resurgence of transcendental arguments in order to rebuff the skeptic. That's important, an important insight that you have to realize to understand the contemporary debate. Most contemporary transcendental arguments are used to rebuff the skeptic challenge to certain types of issues. The skeptic comes up and says, how do you know that that chair over there is real? How do you know you're not seeing an illusion? Or how do you know that's just not a sense impression that your mind is reconstructing? And so philosophers have traditionally tried to refute the skeptic. Modern philosophers have used transcendental arguments to try to rebuff those types of skeptical considerations. Modern philosophy, as Dr. Bahnsen started off yesterday explaining, is very narrow in its outlook. And so that explains partly why transcendental arguments aren't that prevalent today. Most philosophers try to break down the field into narrow and narrower and narrower portions, forgetting the whole picture, or their excuse is, well, we can't make sense of these big issues until we make sense of these little issues. And so because transcendental arguments typically take on major issues, most modern philosophers, at least analytical philosophers, don't have any interest at all in them. Let me give you an example. I have a friend going to the University of California, and he's studying with a professor who has an interest, and his only interest in philosophy is within the philosophy of language, which basically asks, what is meaning? How do words refer to the world? How does language work? Questions like that. And his professor is not just interested in that narrow field of philosophy, but he's interested in one particular question within that narrow field. He's interested in a topic called direct reference. How do words refer to objects? My friend says that if you ask him questions in other fields of logic or other fields of philosophy, he just has no interest in it. And so he is probably a extreme example of how philosophers have become very pedantic and narrow in their focus. But he is representative in the sense that philosophers aren't interested in the big questions. So that explains to some degree why a lot of modern philosophers aren't interested in transcendental arguments. The one thing that should strike us is that if transcendental arguments are so powerful, as Van Til and Dr. Bahnsen maintain, why is it that there's at least not more philosophers interested in this? And to answer that question is going to take up the bulk of our time. I'm going to give you some philosophers who have thought that they do work, and then give you the reasons why other philosophers, the majority perhaps, think that they are not good arguments at all. Now, before I get into the details, let me please encourage you to ask questions and stop me as we go along. I know Dr. Bahnsen brought this up yesterday, but some of the stuff we're going to get into is quite honestly difficult. And so if I say a word that you have no idea what it means, stop me and interrupt me, and we'll trace our steps backwards and explain it hopefully better. Before we get into the contemporary debate, we need to understand some background information in order to take full advantage or to really come to grips with what's going on today. In order to understand modern transcendental arguments, you have to understand what a conceptual scheme is. Most modern transcendental arguments take the form of arguing that certain types of concepts are necessary for our conceptual scheme. So the first question we have to ask before we get into the debate is, what is a conceptual scheme? I put here that a conceptual scheme is that scheme through which we interpret our experience, and it's our conceptual resources that we bring into our experience. A conceptual scheme is a scheme through which we interpret our experience, bringing to bear on our experience our conceptual resources. Now, that's not going to be too helpful until I give you some illustrations. Let's pretend that we had there's not one in this room, but let's pretend that there was a box right here that was made of wood with the glass in front of it, with silver knobs, and a black wire coming from the back and hooking into the wall. Now, what would we all think of that box? Well, I don't know if I'm describing it well enough, but I'm describing a television. If we came into this room and saw what I described, we'd immediately conceive of that object as a television. And the reason is we've lived in the Western world, we've had interaction with modern technology, and so we bring certain concepts to bear on our experience. We have certain types of ways of understanding and interpreting the world around us. What would happen if we brought an Aborigine from Australia who's never had contact with any Westerner and saw the same thing we did? You'd say it was a microwave? Well, what would he think of it? Would he see this? Let me ask you a trick question. Would he say the same thing that we did? No? Okay. Well, right. The answer is yes and no. He would have, as philosophers call, the same phenomenological experience, in the sense that we'd see the brown on the wood, we'd see the glass, the shimmering glass, we'd see the silver knobs on the front, and he would have the same phenomenological experience, in the sense that he would see the same thing we would. Okay, so the difference isn't that we have different biological and perceptual apparatus than he does. Basically, we're hooked up the same. If his perceptual apparatuses are operating properly, then he's going to phenomenologically see the same thing we do. However, conceptually, he's not going to see the same thing as we do at all. We both see the same phenomena or the same object, but we see the object differently. I see the object as a television. He sees the object as who knows what, an ugly artifact or whatever. I don't know what he would possibly.
Can you give another illustration of that, not based on artifacts, just out of a natural world? If I go out in the field and I look at a particular portion of the field along with an American Indian guide, he and I see the very same thing. Yeah. I see bent grass, he sees bent grass. But on the other hand, because of his experience in the wilderness, he sees a deer's footprint, whereas I see bent grass. And so if you ask, do you see the same thing? The answer is yes and no. We see the same things that are bent, green grass, bent, and so forth. But his conceptual scheme is richer. He sees something there that I don't. Same point in your illustration, but it doesn't depend upon what technology.
Okay. So everybody understand the distinction between seeing and seeing as. That's going to be important to understand the modern debate on transcendental arguments. Let me give you one more example and we'll move on. If we were to open a calculus textbook, and I don't know what your background in mathematics is, mine isn't strong at all, and there we were to look at the equations sprawled out across the page, I would see that as just a bunch of numbers and formula and wouldn't be able to make heads or tails out of it. Now, if the mathematician looked at that formula, he'd be able to see it as something that made sense. He'd probably be able to solve it. We'd both see the same thing on the page, the same print, but we'd see it differently. He'd see it as something that could be solved. I'd see it as something that merely perplexed me. Okay, there's a distinction between seeing something and seeing something as something. In other words, interpreting something. Okay, now there are levels in our conceptual scheme of conceptual centeredness. There are levels of conceptual centeredness. And I'm going to give you 3 levels and tell you what I mean by that. Some concepts within our conceptual scheme are more important or more central than other concepts. Let me start off by giving a concept that's not very central at all to our scheme. Most of us, I'm sure all of us, have the concept of the game of billiards. We could all sit back right now and think of what the game of billiards, or the concept of the game of billiards is. It's a game where there are I think there's 15 colored balls. There's a white cue ball that you use to strike the colored balls. It's played on a flat table with 6 pockets. The cue ball is struck by a stick, and the object of the game is to put the colored balls in the pocket in certain orders. Okay, so that is a concept that all of us share. If we were to lose that concept, our outlook on the world, or our conceptual scheme, wouldn't be greatly impoverished. We could get on in life very well, unless we were professional billiard players, I guess, but we could get on very well in life if we didn't have the concept of a game of billiards. Okay, another concept, however, that's more central is the concept of a game. The concept of the game is, Wittgenstein talks about what a game is, and there's no one definition of it. He said games have a family relationship with one another. But games, basically, the concept of the game is much more central to our conceptual scheme than the concept of the game of billiards, because it's much more general. If we were to lose the concept of a game, or we didn't have it within our conceptual scheme, our lives would be somewhat impoverished. Mainly because we wouldn't understand or be able to play basketball, and that's really bad. Okay. But you wouldn't be able to play billiards either. You wouldn't understand craps or blackjack or football, and on and on and on. Any type of game you wouldn't understand. If you didn't have the concept of what it means or what it is to be a game, all those type of activities that we enjoy and engage in regularly, we wouldn't be able to. It wouldn't make any sense to us. Okay, so that, you can see a game is more central, the concept of the game is more central than the concept of the game of billiards. Now, I should, at this point, stop and say, I'm not talking about the word game. We could easily get on without the word game. We could use another word in its place to mean the same thing. I'm not talking about words, I'm talking about the concept of the game. Okay, finally, there's things that are much more central than the concept of game to our conceptual outlook. One example is the concept of causation. The concept that certain events happen for certain reasons, for causes typically antecedent or previous to them. If in some way, if somehow our conceptual scheme lost the concept of causation, what would be the ramifications? What would our conceptual scheme be like if we didn't have the concept of causation? Well, you wouldn't have the ability to play games, because all games presuppose the concept of causation. Billiards, for example, is the easiest example.
How can you eliminate conceptual scheme of billiards at a lower level without also eliminating cause and effect? I mean, wouldn't you have to limit yourself and say this conceptual scheme includes this, but not that? I mean, if you lose the concept of billiards as a conceptual scheme, it also includes cause and effect.
Sure. I'm just saying, what if we were to lose or didn't have the concept of billiards? I'm not saying that we'd lose also the concept of cause and effect. I'm just saying, just pretend that the concept, nobody ever invented the game billiards. That's basically what I'm trying to get you to understand. What would happen if nobody invented the game billiards? How would that affect our conceptual scheme? Not much, unless you were, what's that guy's name, Minnesota Fats? Okay, that would affect you big, but unless you weren't, no big deal. Game is much more central. If we didn't have the concept of game, our life would be more impoverished. If we didn't have the concept of causation, it's not really clear what we'd have left of our conceptual scheme. We wouldn't be able to play games, because games presuppose the idea of cause and effect. If you didn't have the idea of cause and effect, then what point would there be to play basketball? If you didn't believe that.
Can you qualify that a bit? Don't gamblers' games deny causation? They're based on chance, right?
Mm-hmm.
It might appear so. I just want to make sure no one's misled. Is craft assume causation, or is craft the denial of causation?
Well, In a sense, yes. In a sense, no. The point I'm trying to make, though, is if you didn't have the concept of causation, you still wouldn't be able to play craps. The reason is you believe that if you do certain things, roll the dice or pull the lever, that certain mechanisms are going to bring certain states of affairs. Most people take them to be random states of affairs. But without the concept of causation, you wouldn't be able to even think about bringing one state of affairs into existence from another state of affairs without a concept of cause.
I feel there's two types of causes. There, we might bear some light on this. There's what's called special causes, where you can attribute that cause to the effect and link it up to the aha. I know why the paper boy came 3 days, came 2 hours later this day. Because he didn't get up on time and he was sick. Versus a random cause where it's still caused by something, the fact he came late, but you can't attribute it to any factor. It's too complex to figure out. Same thing with the roll of dice. There's a cause for why the tree came up. Can you give me that cause so you can predict and control? No, it's too complex.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that the cause and effect relationship is not there.
Right. That's a good point. You basically, what Bill is saying is that all things presuppose causation, all activities that we engage in, games, whatever. But sometimes we're not able to attribute what exactly the cause is for a particular state. That's simply an epistemological problem. We just simply don't know what the cause of a certain state of affairs is, although we believe that there is a cause. We don't believe that things spontaneously happen for no reason or for no cause whatsoever. No. You couldn't play games. You couldn't do science. You couldn't go to work. You couldn't do theology. What's the first doctrine of the Bible? Well,
No rational basis.
probably. I mean, you probably could make a decision, but you wouldn't have any. There wouldn't be any. If you didn't believe in causation or you didn't have the concept of causation, you could make decisions, I guess, but they wouldn't have any purpose behind them. You could just decide to do something. But you couldn't do theology. The first doctrine of the Bible is God spoke and created the world. Without the concept of causation, the concept of creation makes no sense. Okay, so if we lose the concept of causation, we've lost something that is central to our conceptual scheme, and it wouldn't be anything recognizable to us. If we didn't have the concept of causation, our outlook on the world would be completely different, so much so that it would be difficult to even imagine what the world would be like or what our experience would be like. Well, maybe. I don't want to beg any questions, but many philosophers think that is the case. Some philosophers think that there could be a causeless conceptual scheme or a conceptual scheme without cause. Whether that's true or not, it certainly is correct to say that it would be so different that it would have no similarities to our conceptual scheme.
But you could prove that otherwise by the transcendental argument.
Prove that there is causation.
Yeah.
This is a long way of getting to set up the modern debate in contemporary transcendental arguments, and so this type of thing is going to. What I'm trying to do now is show you that transcendental arguments try to show the necessity of certain types of concepts. Okay, and I got a few more things to say before I get there, but you're going off in the right direction. You're anticipating right where I want to go.
Can I just piggyback on that? It seems like some modern philosophers who would say you can have a causeless conceptual scheme, but they can't say that without assuming causation.
Right. They'd say there's the possibility. You can't a priori say that there's no such thing as that type of conceptual scheme. But as soon as they started explaining what it would be like, they're going to get in big trouble.
One other point I mean, before you go on, without the conceptual scheme of cause, I think it still happens. But what about someone in a worldview where everything is magical? Like a Satan worldview where some mysterious forces, like even before Homer, they had this thing, I forget the name for it, but it was the mysterious stream, Moira, is what it's called, I'm not sure now.
Mm-hmm.
And
Fate.
that became fate later. There's a thing is, it was, who knows what it would do. That, I guess, essentially was the cause.
Right.
But it was kind of a magical concept.
Well, but that's still, remember, that's an epistemological problem. They just don't know what the fates are up to. But they know that whatever happens, fate causes to happen. Okay, everybody on board with this? Loosely speaking, the concept of causation is what is called in philosophy a transcendental. The concept of causation is sometimes or often called a transcendental, for those who use that type of vocabulary. For our purposes, we're going to call that a transcendental. What does this mean? For our purposes, for the present purposes, transcendental, the word transcendental, used as a noun, is a condition of experience. Something transcendental is the condition for some kind of experience. The concept of causation is a transcendental for most of our experience of, well, just leave it there, for most of our experience. The concept of causation is transcendental for our experience. The concept of game is a transcendental to the concept of a game of billiards. Okay? That lies in back of the game of billiards. Without that, you couldn't have the concept of billiards. Even more general, without the concept of causation, our experience would be unintelligible or completely different. For the concept of a game of billiards, right? All I'm pointing out here is that there's different types of transcendentals. Transcendentals is usually indexed to a certain type of experience or a certain concept. The concept of game is a transcendental to the concept of the game of billiards, but even more general, the concept of causation is a transcendental to many different types of experiences. Now, transcendental, therefore, is different from transcendent. I'm going to define transcendence as that which goes beyond human experience. Based upon that definition, can we have knowledge of the transcendent? No, definitionally. Transcendent, something transcendent is something that goes beyond human experience. We can't have knowledge of things that go beyond human experience. Now, I'll take a detour now. Doesn't the Bible teach that God is transcendent? Therefore, should we conclude with the Neo-Orthodox that we can't have any knowledge, true knowledge of God? The Bible teaches that God is beyond us, but God is also immanent. We don't know God fully. We don't know God as He is in Himself and all that encompasses, otherwise we would be God. But God does reveal Himself and is immanent and is able to speak to us. So we can have knowledge of God. But there are things in God that are transcendent, that are beyond us. Transcendental refers to the preconditions for certain types of knowledge. We can have knowledge of transcendental things or concepts. We cannot have knowledge of transcendent things. Okay, so a lot of people confuse those. It needs to have the nomenclature down.
So everything we know about God is not transcendent?
Well, we know that God is transcendent, but the knowledge that we have, we don't have knowledge of particular knowledge of God's transcendence. We don't know certain things about God. So
know of God is not transcendent.
Now a transcendental, pardon me?
It may not be transcendent, but it's still transcendental.
No.
It still provides for us a precondition.
Okay, I see what you mean. Yeah, the knowledge of God is a transcendental to any type of knowledge whatsoever. Right. That wasn't the direction I was going, but that's the correct insight.
That knowledge would be transcendent in terms of being beyond our experience, but it would be a transcendental.
It'd be our knowledge of God is a transcendental for our experience. Without it, we couldn't have any intelligible experience. However, knowing God, knowing things about God, say that He is 3 in 1, or that He is has sent Jesus, His Son, to die for our sins. That knowledge is not transcendental knowledge in any straightforward sense. That's just simply knowledge of theology, what God has done for us and what God is like.
If God is transcendent, then you have to get transcendental for revelation.
Oh yeah, the transcendental to all knowledge is that God reveals Himself. Without God revealing Himself, we couldn't have any knowledge whatever.
Well, that's the definition of something could not know unless God revealed it beyond our human experience.
Okay, transcendental arguments, this is a long way of saying transcendental arguments try to show transcendentals. The conclusions of transcendental arguments try to get us to transcendentals. Not transcendent things, transcendentals. And the reason this is important is to make it stand in contrast to deductive and inductive type of arguments. Somebody give me a quick definition of a deductive argument. What is a deductive argument?
That the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises. Another way of saying it is that the conclusion gives you nothing new. It's already embedded.
Right. If the premises are true, that's a qualification. Then in a deductive argument, the conclusion is true. Deductive arguments and inductive arguments refer to the form of argumentation. Transcendental arguments, although they do refer to a form of argumentation, I'll get to that in a moment, but they also include the type of conclusion that's drawn in the argument itself. Deductive arguments, when we talk about deductive arguments, we don't make any reference to the type of conclusion that is being drawn, except for the fact that the conclusion follows from the premises. But what becomes a conclusion in a deductive argument can be any number of things. It can be that, well, I put a couple examples down here. This is for Dr. Bonson. If Notre Dame beats USC 10 years in a row, Trojan fans should hang their heads in shame. Notre Dame has beaten USC 10 years in a row. Therefore, what's the conclusion? Trojan fans should hang their heads in shame, right? Now we could think of other arguments, okay? We could make a conclusion to some arguments that the concept of causation was legitimate. Let's say I'll make up something. If Bill is drinking coffee from Dietrich's, then the concept of causation is legitimate. Bill is drinking coffee from Dietrich's, therefore the concept of causation is legitimate. Now, let's just I'm not interested in the arguments themselves. I just want to show you the conclusions. Both of those are valid deductive arguments. One conclusion said that the concept of causation was legitimate. It was a bad argument, of course, but valid. The other conclusion was that Trojan fans should hang their heads in shame. Now, what do those two conclusions have in common? Anything? No, they're completely different. One has to do with something very general and abstract. The other one has to do with something fairly mundane in life. There is no common element in the conclusions of one deductive argument and another one, or I should say not any necessary correlation between the two. Deductive and inductive arguments make no reference to the type of conclusions drawn. Transcendental arguments make a reference to the type of conclusion that is being drawn. The conclusions of transcendental arguments are purported to be or aimed to be transcendentals. That's important to understand. Now, why am I bringing this up? Well, in the debates on transcendental arguments, there have been some people who think that when you compare a transcendental argument to a deductive argument, for example, all you're doing is comparing two different forms of argumentation. Now, there is something to that, but that isn't all that's going on between the two. To say that there's an inductive argument, a deductive argument, and then a transcendental argument, and that they're only different in form, is to make a mistake. To put them all in that category of types of argument forms is a mistake. It's actually what's called a category mistake in philosophy. To say that there's deductive, inductive, and transcendental arguments and not make any qualifications is to make a category mistake. Now, who knows anybody here familiar with what a category mistake is?
Asking the question, what does green taste like?
Right. Green isn't in the category of things that have taste. Green apples are, but green doesn't have any reference to taste whatsoever. Gilbert Ryle, in his book, The Concept of Mind, used this example. He said that somebody gave us a tour of Oxford University and took us through all the buildings, and we saw Jesus College, we saw Radcliffe Camera, the Bodleian Library, and we saw all of the campus. And then at the end of the day, we said, boy, that was a great tour. Now show me Oxford University. That is a category mistake. And the reason is you're putting Oxford University in the same category as the buildings that make up Oxford University. Oxford University just is all those things. It is Radcliffe Cameron, Jesus College, and on and on and on. Okay, so that is what a conceptual category mistake is. Many people who put deductive, inductive, and transcendental arguments on the same level are making category mistakes if they don't make further refinements.
Could you, in one statement, describe deductive and inductive arguments into their conclusions versus, you said the conclusions to transcendental arguments result in transcendental.
Right. Try to.
Conclusions to deductive and inductive arguments.
Their conclusions, the conclusions of those type of arguments are not anything, they don't conclude to anything in particular. In other words, when you may have a deductive argument, it can be the minutest or the most banal type of thing, or it can be the most highly abstract type of thing. When you talk about deductive arguments, it's not the conclusion that you're drawing attention to, it's simply the form. But in a transcendental argument, formal only. Transcendental arguments have more to do than mere form. They try to get to or conclude in transcendental.
Would that be material?
I'm going to get to the formal aspect of them. Right, the material. There's the material aspect of these arguments is important, not just the form. Right, right.
Whereas the other
Just the form. Now, let me give you the typical form of most transcendental arguments. So what I've just said is that there's a material aspect that's necessary for a transcendental argument, but that's not a sufficient condition for a transcendental argument. There's also a formal aspect. And you should get this into your notes. I'm just going to read this to you, and then I'm going to explain it. This is the typical form of a transcendental argument. For X to be the case, and what I mean by X here is just a placeholder. In mathematics, we put X squared plus Y squared equals, and that's just a placeholder. Okay, for X, for something to be the case, Y would have to be the case. For X to be the case, Y would have to be the case because Y is a precondition of X. X is the case, this is the next part, and so Y is the case. For X to be the case, Y would have to be the case because Y is a precondition of X. X is the case, and so Y is the case. Now, the because clause here is the thing that we want to pay attention to from the outset. The because clause is usually proved by a reductio ad absurdum argument. For X to be the case, Y would have to be the case because Y is a precondition of X. Now, how do we prove that because? Well, by reductio ad absurdum argument. We try to do what the transcendental arguments try to do is that if you didn't have Y, then you couldn't have X. So you assume not Y. And you show that starting with not Y, you couldn't have X. Okay, so it's an indirect reductio. Reductio ad absurdum arguments are arguments where you take, in this case, there's informal reductio ad absurdum arguments, but in this case, we're talking about a formal reductio. You assume the opposite of something. And you show that when you assume the opposite of something, then whatever you wanted to hold previously, you couldn't hold to. In other words, it would generate a contradiction. So we want to have, everybody agrees X is the case. And the claim is, in order for X to be the case, I'm going to give you some examples in a moment, so if you're having trouble following, just bear with me for a moment. Sure. For X to be the case, everybody agrees that there is an X. Okay, whatever that may be. I'm going to give you an example in a moment. But the precondition somebody claims for X is Y. In order for there to be X, which everybody grants, somebody claims that Y is necessary. Now, how are we going to prove this? Well, the way you prove this is to assume not Y. You say, well, let's just pretend Y wasn't the case. And then you show that if Y wasn't the case, then after a reductio argument, the conclusion is X couldn't be the case. But remember, everybody agrees that X is the case. This is a given. This is something that all parties are agreeing to. If Y isn't the case, then X couldn't be the case. So what is that? What can we conclude from this?
If Y is not the case, Y is.
If X is not the case, if Y is not the case, there is no X. But X is the case. So Y has to. So we have to conclude not Y. In other words, Y is the case. Okay, so that's the way you prove the because clause in a transcendental argument, typically. Now let me give you some examples.
Say that Y is the wrong transcendental. I mean, if you prove that Y isn't there, but still then X is there.
Oh yeah, well,
After the wrong.